Hello and welcome to another MSDP tutorial video. In today's video, we're going to look at the Arpeggiator module, created by Mann. The Arpeggiator module is a tool that allows us to generate melodic and harmonic content that can be used to control any of the instruments from the sound menu. For today's demonstration, I've gone ahead and put together a simple sound using the A+2 instrument, which has a couple of saw waveforms loaded into it, and the stereo echo effect, which provides a little bit more depth and shape to the sound. I'll go ahead and play a couple of notes in this now so we can hear what that sounds like. So that's the sound that we're going to be using today, but we'll be controlling this instrument with the Arpeggiator module. Arpeggiators are tools that take collections of notes and convert them into patterns. So we see that we have a keyboard laid across the top of the module, which we can either play by clicking on the notes, or what I'm going to do today is I'm going to use my Arturia MIDI controller to simply play and hold down note collections. These collections of notes are then going to be turned into patterns following this grid here. The grid by default is synchronized with the master metronome, and since the metronome is already on, we can see that that grid is being stepped through, one step at a time. If we want to send MIDI data from the arpeggiator to the saw instrument over here, the first thing and the most critical thing that we need to do is we need to tell the arpeggiator to send the data to that module using the module's automation ID. So if I want to take this ID, I simply need to select that name, copy it, and then in the arpeggiator module, I need to paste it and then hit enter. So we can hear that that is generating a note by default, but if I wanted it to choose from a collection, I could hold down a collection of notes on my keyboard and then turn that arpeggiator on again. Now we have a variety of presets for this grid that we can choose from using this drop-down menu here. I'm going to cycle through some of those as I hold down that same collection so that we can hear how these different shapes will create different types of patterns. Notice that as I hold down different collections of notes, the arpeggiator updates and creates patterns from those new collections. So along with those preset patterns, we can generate our own patterns by simply clicking on the positions on the grid that we want to use. I'm going to hit the clear button, which will clear that grid, and then I can start to click on any of these unselected steps to activate those. Notice that if nothing is selected, no note will be generated. So we can see that that grid is a really nice way of creating patterns and shapes that can be defined by the various note collections that we choose. But unlike a lot of traditional arpeggiators, we're not confined to only one note at a time. We can actually select multiple positions on a single step to create harmonies, so that we can have both melodies and harmonies being created by this arpeggiator. That alone makes it a very powerful tool, but there's a lot left that we can learn about the arpeggiator by looking at the different parameters. If we look directly to the right of the on-off toggle, we can see an option that says Octave Tools. We have the number of octaves and then the octave offset. By default, with octave 1 selected, this pattern will only play from the selected notes. But if we increase that number, then those notes will be duplicated at the octave above, or at 2 octaves above, or 3 octaves above, to create patterns that climb higher than the selected notes. We can also offset that starting octave, either by shifting it up in the positive domain or down into the negative domain. So if I have an offset of -2, that means we have a range for this pattern that is 4 octaves tall, but we're going to start 2 octaves below the currently selected notes. And these can all be shifted in real time. To the right of the clear and pattern selector, we can see note duration. This is going to determine the actual duration of the notes being played as a multiple of the step duration. So we can see that the steps right now are set to an 1/8 note subdivision of the metronome, and with note duration at 1, that means every note is also going to be an 1/8 note long. But if we bring that value to something less than 1, now the notes will end before the step ends, and we can actually make rather short notes this way. So I'll set a duration to 0.5, and we'll try that again. We can now hear that there's a bit of space between the notes. If we set that duration to a value above 1, this will create a legato effect as notes blend into each other. For the remainder of this video, I'm going to set that note duration to 0.5. Now, to go further into the controls, we need to look at the right-hand column, where we actually have 3 small tabs of information, but each of these tabs can drastically change the way that this module works. Let's start with the time tab. As with any module that can synchronize with the metronome, we have the option of synchronizing to the master global metronome, or the option to set it to a custom metronome built into this particular module. The custom metronome option is great if you want to create polyrhythms or if you want to create concepts and patterns that are out of sync with each other. For this demonstration, I'm going to keep the metronome set to the global option, but I'm going to change the subdivisions so that we can hear this run at faster or slower speeds. I'll turn that arpeggiator on again. And now I'm going to set the subdivisions to smaller values. 16th notes work rather nicely. If we set it to whole notes, we can create slower textures. For now, I'll leave this at 8th note. The next tab, the Dimensions tab, allows us to change the size of the grid. By default, we have a grid that is 8 pitches tall and 16 steps long. But we can shrink this if we want a simpler pattern, or we can grow this up to 16 if we want more options. In a similar way, we can choose fewer steps if we want a shorter pattern, or more steps if we want a longer pattern. At the highest settings, we can see that it can be difficult to see every grid step, but it is still possible to choose and select individual spots. Finally, let's look at the Random tab, which allows us to generate random patterns on our grid. If we click New, it will clear the current grid selection and replace it with a new randomized selection of activated grid steps. Add functions similarly, but it adds new random grid steps without clearing it first. Clicking this a few times can create an accumulation of steps. Finally, we have the continuous random toggle and an amount option for that. With the continuous random toggle on, every time the grid sequence begins again, a new collection of random steps will be activated. This allows us to create a continually evolving sequence of notes from the notes that we've selected above. With the amount set to 1, we'll either have no pitch activated or 1 pitch. If we scale that value up, we'll now have a number between 0 and that maximum number as our number of notes for each step. The arpeggiator is a very powerful and very customizable tool that allows us to generate all sorts of content for our projects. It's one of my favorite tools, and I'm very grateful to Michael Mann for all the work that he put into making this module a possibility. That concludes this tutorial video. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back soon with more.